The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Our next speaker will be Erin Alexander, speaking to you about building knowledge and confidence as your child's advocate. Erin Alexander is the Assistant Director for Clinical Services at the Tennessee Center for the Study and Treatment of Dyslexia at Middle Tennessee State University. She trains and supervises graduate assistants who conduct assessments at the center, consults with parents and school personnel regarding how to best identify and support students with reading difficulties, provides workshops for parents, and delivers professional development to school personnel. She is a nationally certified school psychologist who previously worked in that role for a Tennessee school district. Erin is a member of the Tennessee Dyslexia Advisory Council, which was established in 2016 to advise the Tennessee Department of Education on matters related to dyslexia. Ms. Alexander is also a certified academic language practitioner who provides intervention to students with characteristics of dyslexia. Ms. Erin Alexander.
Thank you. Thank you guys again for coming and spending your Saturday with us. It's really encouraging for us to see all these parents and teachers who want to help kids, and we definitely appreciate you. So in my work at the center, I've worked there for about 10 years now. I've done a lot of meetings with parents. So after we test children, we talk about what the results are and kind of what that means in the schools and what the next steps are for you, depending on where you are, what kind of school your child is in, things like that. And I know there's a lot of questions out there because this stuff is complicated, right? There's a lot of laws, a lot of rules. It depends on what kind of school you're in, what state you're in. So there's a lot of confusion out there. So our goal for this next hour is to try to clear up some of that confusion. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the types of reading problems that there are. Of course, being the Dyslexia Center, we're going to focus a lot on dyslexia because that is the most common reading disability. We're going to talk about how to request help from your school. So whether it be asking for an evaluation or asking for additional just information on how your child is doing, how to ask for extra help and interventions. We're going to talk about state and federal laws that are in place to help us find kids who struggle to read and have other learning problems. We know those laws and procedures and systems are not perfect, but we will try to talk about what is there. There are strengths and weaknesses to all these systems, but just so you can have more knowledge, because knowledge is power, right? So we want also to talk about the range of supports and services available. So not every student who struggles to read needs the same thing. So as Bradley was telling us, they're like snowflakes, right? Not every child is the same as another child just because they both have the same label or diagnosis. Okay, so first the bad news. So the National Assessment for Educational Progress, if I'm saying that right, yes, in 2019, they collected some data and they found that, we're really not doing any better than we have been as a nation at teaching our kids how to read. So over a third of fourth graders, eighth graders, and 12th graders are not meeting proficiency standards for reading. So are all of these kids dyslexic? No. So we got to figure out how to find the kids who are. And we won't talk about all the reasons why this might be happening, but it's a sad story for our country. So if we don't find these children early, there are some long-term consequences. If we don't provide the supports that Bradley was talking about, these children are more likely to have low self-esteem, to experience anxiety, depression, mental health problems and even disorders, they're more likely to go to jail. We know we have a large percentage of students, or not students, but adults in jail who can't read or can't read well. They're more likely to earn less than the typical person, and less likely to graduate from high school and participate in higher education or be employed. So we've got to do a lot of things to, again, nurture those strengths in our students, but also we have to catch these problems early so that we can prevent all this. And that doesn't mean that every person who has a reading problem will end up in one of these situations, but again, we want to find them early. So the dyslexia paradox. We know that early intervention is crucial. The earlier we catch these kids, the earlier we provide intervention, the better the outcome. We can keep that gap between them and their peers from getting wider if we put in early intervention, kindergarten, first, second grade. But we know that typically dyslexia is not identified until kids are in second or third grade. How many of you guys have been told, we can't test right now, we have to wait till she's in third grade? Yes, that's a myth. That's a myth. But one of the reasons for that is because we used to have what we called, unfortunately, a wait to fail model in our country. So the traditional model for identifying learning disabilities was to find a child's IQ score, find their achievement score, and see if the gap was big enough for the child to be eligible for services. And so when they're little, we can see that they're struggling to learn how to read, but those scores aren't always low enough to qualify for services. So that has led to new and improved models for identifying students in our schools. Not every state does things exactly the same way. I know we have some people joining us from other states online, and we appreciate you being here as well. So there are some differences from state to state, but for the most part, our country has gone to what we call a response to intervention model. And again, it's not perfect, but it is an attempt to make sure that we are not waiting too long to provide this crucial early intervention. All right, so the goal of screening, which is what we're going to talk about first, is to find these kids who are at risk for reading difficulties, provide the intervention as soon as possible, because we want to reduce the risk of later reading problems and keep these problems, if they're there, from becoming more severe over time. Okay, so you may or may not agree with this, but ideally, schools are the best place to find these students. Why might that be? Any ideas? Any teachers here?
Compare them to other students.
Thank you, yeah. So teachers have a lot of experience with children at a certain grade level, right? So they can see which kids are not meeting those grade level expectations, which kids are taking longer to finish work. Any other thoughts on that? Other teachers? Do teachers pretty much, can you raise your hand if you're a teacher? Yes, okay. Do you know which students are struggling? Yeah. So you do classwork, you get grades all the time on tests and things like that. Also, that's where the students are all the time, right? Yeah. So at our center, we do some evaluations, but we are a very small staff, and we can't reach every child out there. If you think of all the kids who struggle to read in Tennessee, so the schools are the best place to do that. They work with the child every day, and there are mechanisms and laws and regulations in place that schools must use in order to find these kids. Some do it better than others, but they are trying. Okay, so goals of RTI, response to intervention, is the model that we're going to be talking about. Prevention and early intervention. So it's usually represented by a triangle. Sometimes you'll see it upside down, sometimes you'll see it the other way. In Tennessee, it's called response to instruction and intervention, which is RTI squared for short. In other states, they may call it RTI. It's basically the same thing. So tier 1 is basically all children in school. Their core instruction, they receive typically an hour to hour and a half a day of reading and language arts instruction. It looks different at different ages, of course. But ideally, we want Tier 1 to meet the needs of 80 to 85% of students if it's done well. We will screen children 3 times a year in our public schools to identify which kids are in need of extra help, extra support and instruction. And that would be through Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions. So based on how they do on the screening, we find which kids are at risk. We decide if they need a Tier 2 intervention or if they need a more intense intervention with Tier 3. So these numbers don't look the same in every school, but the idea is that 10 to 15% of children will have their needs met in Tier 2, and even fewer should need Tier 3. And again, that depends on a strong Tier 1 reading instruction. All right, so I think we've talked about that a little bit already. We're identifying kids right away, hopefully. And the data that we collect helps us decide how intense the intervention needs to be, how much time do they need, what kind of skills do they need to be working on? Do they need to be working on comprehension, on basic reading, sounding out words, on fluency, et cetera? And it helps us know if our reading instruction in the core instruction, or Tier 1, is doing what it should be doing. So again, 80 to 85% of kids should be served well in Tier 1. So it gives us information about that. Okay, so I think you got a little preview already, but how many of you guys knew before today that Tennessee had a dyslexia law? Okay, I think that's everybody. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about that. You've probably heard some of this before, but you may learn some new details that you didn't know. So in 2016, Tennessee joined other states in passing a dyslexia law, and our dyslexia law says that the Department of Education shall develop procedures to identify characteristics of dyslexia through our already existing universal screening process. So we already had RTI in place. I want to say it was around 2013 that it was rolled out in elementary schools, and then middle school and high schools came a year and then 2 years later. So the screening process for dyslexia is supposed to happen within the RTI process, which was already in place, but we weren't using the word dyslexia then. So in, it was January of 2016, the State Department of Education met with several stakeholders. We had one meeting, and they recognized that, this thing, dyslexia, is being talked about a lot. We probably need to make a statement and give some guidance as a department. So I really appreciate them doing that. But to date, there had been no other official guidance regarding the term dyslexia from our state department. So we've made a lot of gains in that area, but it is still relatively new that we're talking about this term. All right, so there are, like I said, a lot of states that have passed dyslexia laws. We believe it's about 43 states as of May 2019 that have passed dyslexia laws. 29 of those involve screening, like our state does. They're not all exactly the same, but you will see some similarities from state to state. Let's see, improvingliteracy.org. If you're not in Tennessee, you can find out more about what your state is doing. And of course, there are laws kind of in process now as well. Okay, so they focus on different things. Some of them are about raising awareness of dyslexia. So in 2014, we had a dyslexia law that not as many people know about, and it was called the Say Dyslexia, no, that's the wrong one. It was called the Dyslexia is Real bill. That was the first attempt at passing legislation in our state. It basically recognized the International Dyslexia Association's definition of dyslexia, which we'll go over. And it also said that teachers need to learn more about dyslexia, and colleges need to teach the pre-service teachers more about dyslexia. But it didn't have a whole lot of teeth to it, but it was a good start. Some of these laws are about identifying students with dyslexia, so screening laws. A lot of them are focused on K through 2 or K through 3. Our law is focused on K through 12. And some of these laws also focus on intervention and say that students with dyslexia have to have a certain type of intervention, and ours does that as well. Okay, so what is dyslexia? So basically, we can break the word dyslexia into 3 parts. So dys meaning difficulty with, just think about it very basically. Difficulty with, lex meaning having to do with words, and then the IA is just a combining form that helps us come up with the word dyslexia. This term has been around for a really long time. The term dyslexia was first used in 1887. Can you believe that? But yet we're still struggling to understand and to be comfortable with the word, right? So the term learning disability that's used in our schools didn't come along till, I want to say, the late 60s, which is interesting. Okay. All right, so here's our definition from the International Dyslexia Association. This is based on research, so a team of researchers got together and they agreed on this definition. So basically, it's a specific learning disability. So there are several types of learning disabilities. We will go into some of those a little bit later, but this one is primarily related to reading and spelling. It's neurobiological in origin, so that means that the brain is involved, and it is basically the language parts of the brain that are affected or different. So students with dyslexia struggle to process language and to attach sounds with letters. And it's neurobiological. It also means that it's hereditary. So it does tend to run in families. Okay, it's characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition. So our students with dyslexia, adults with dyslexia, have trouble recognizing words accurately and quickly. So a lot of times they may have to stop and sound out the word, even though they've seen it a lot of times, rather than recognizing it right away. We also see poor spelling and poor decoding. So decoding is basically your ability to sound out words. Typically, these deficits are a result of problems with phonological processing, which we will talk about a little bit later. So basically, it's just difficulty with understanding the sound structure of our language and being able to manipulate sounds and words. And note the word typically there. So we don't always find these phonological processing deficits in all of our tests for all of our children. That doesn't mean that they don't have dyslexia, okay? It's often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So basically we're saying that these students are just as smart as anybody else. They have strengths, as we've heard about this morning. But when you put the paper in front of them, it just doesn't match what you know they can do in other areas and how smart they are, right? It's also unexpected in relation to the provision of effective classroom instruction. So we want to make sure that all of our students are provided with good research-based instruction first. And it's the students who aren't responding like their peers are that are really the ones who have dyslexia. Okay, secondary consequences. Problems with reading comprehension often happens because these kids are not reading the same level of books as their peers are. They're really struggling over the words. They're not being able to focus on what they're reading because they're so focused on what that word is in front of them. Or if you read the wrong word, that's going to mess up what you think the story's about, right? So over time, if we don't provide the right interventions, these students are not going to be reading as much as their peers are, and they're not going to want to anyway, because who wants to do something that's hard for you, right? So we do have to encourage them to read and to access material a different way through audiobooks. But over time, reduced reading experience can lead to less vocabulary growth, less background knowledge growth, because a lot of what we learn about words and about the world is through what we read. Okay, so that is our definition. This definition is also used in our Tennessee law that was passed in 2014. It's also used in a lot of other states. Okay, so basically we can break it down to this. So you don't have to memorize all of that long definition. We just have to know that students with dyslexia are the ones who are inaccurate or inefficient word readers. They have inaccurate spelling and they have slow response to instruction. And 5 to 17% of the population is thought to have developmental dyslexia. Those prevalence rates do vary depending on how they define dyslexia in the study. But generally the 5 to 17% range clinical and school samples is what we think it is. There may be more who have characteristics of a dyslexia, however. So that number is really hard to nail down for sure. Okay, so going back to our dyslexia law, again, it happens through RTI. So we're identifying those characteristics through the RTI process in our public schools. So this law doesn't necessarily apply to a private school setting. Okay, so our law also specifies who can request screening. So parent or guardian, teacher, school counselor, or school psychologist, which I find this part interesting. I think there are other people at the school who could also request the screening, such as a principal, if they thought that was needed. So I wouldn't consider this to be the only people that can request it. But just know, if you're a parent and the school hasn't said anything about the dyslexia screening, you can always ask. The law also says that there is a school-based problem-solving team that would convene, and they would talk about accommodations that a child might need. So that's things like extra time on tests if they need it, things read aloud. It really just depends on the child and what their needs are, what interventions would be necessary, and then assistive technology. So again, things like audiobooks or text-to-speech kind of devices or things like that. We already had a school-based problem-solving team before our law was passed that is supposed to advise on these things. So that problem-based or problem-solving team should include parents, your child's teachers, an interventionist if the reading specialist is working with them, or reading coach, or whatever they call them in your school. A lot of times the administrator's involved or the counselor. If we're thinking about testing, we would involve a school psychologist or a speech language pathologist or other assessment specialist. So that is already in place in most of the schools and the RTI process. And then the dyslexia law also says that we want to use that problem-solving team. A lot of times these teams are called support teams, or S teams for short. I know in Williamson County in Tennessee, it's called a GITE team. Forget what that stands for. GEIT, I think it is. And other names that are similar, okay? Okay, so step one, in a good RTI system, we're basically doing a temperature check. We're doing a real quick screen to see which kids need help, basically, okay? So we do it 3 times a year, usually, fall, winter, spring. It's called universal screening. And we are comparing the students to grade level benchmarks or expectations. So what they do is they give a test to a whole bunch of students in the country. They find out what the typical 3rd grader or whatever grade we're talking about, how they perform, and then we compare that child to those norms, basically. We're talking about skills-based screeners. So that's opposed to another type of screener, which we call standards-based screeners, which those have their place as well, and those are the tests that help the teacher know if what she's teaching for that grade level is being mastered, or if the child's getting close to mastering that by the end of the year. But some students, a lot of students, the ones that we care about today, are not making progress toward those standards, but we have to figure out why. And those standards-based assessments don't give us all the information related to why. So we're going to screen skills that are developmentally appropriate for a child's age. So in kindergarten, we're not going to give an oral reading fluency passage, right? Because they're not ready for that yet. They're not reading. We don't expect them to be able to read a passage yet. So typically around mid to late first is when those start being administered as our screener. So early on, we're going to be looking at letter name knowledge, letter sound knowledge, phonemic awareness, the ability to recognize and manipulate sounds in our words. So those are those pre-reading skills that would be more appropriate for kindergarten or early first grader. So this is just a document from the state. I don't know how well you can see that, but in reading, our skills that we're looking at are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, so that's how accurately and not too fast, but how appropriate their speed is when they read, vocabulary knowledge, and reading comprehension. And here's some examples that you might see in your school. So Ames Webb, Dibbles are commonly used screeners in our country. There's another one called FAST or FastBridge, and then one called Dibbles Next, which has recently changed its name. The company changed to Acadience. So there are others, but these are just some that we know of that are used a lot. So after we do our universal screener, we're going to, actually before we go on, as we're doing our screening process, we're going to consider multiple sources of data. So one of the problems that we've seen over the years with our screeners is that there's a lot of reliance on that one number that you get that one point in time. So schools are trying to do the right thing. They're doing their screener. They know that kids who are below the 25th percentile are the kids that likely need intervention. So that means that they are scoring at or better than only 25% of the kids their age or their grade. But people kind of get overzealous with this number thing, right? So sometimes what happens is we look at the screener and we see, okay, this child's at the 27th percentile today on this screener. We see this child in class, we know he has problems with reading and spelling, and you know, he probably needs some extra help, but you know what, our screener, he says it's at the 25th percentile, I'm not 25th, but the 27th percentile, so can't help him, sorry, right? Yeah. So what the state has done, which I think is good, is to really emphasize that we should be looking at multiple sources of data, not just that one test score, that one point in time, but also looking at the child's work in class, their grades, those tests that the teachers give all the time, and if there's other reason to think that the child might need extra help, then let's give it to him, right? So we're basically giving the teachers permission to use their professional judgment, as well as looking at that universal screening score, which I think is important. I don't think people always knew that they could do that. Okay, so if we find a student who is at risk, so generally speaking, it's 25th percentile or below, we have to do some more digging. Okay, so let's say we've got a student who is in 4th grade and we gave them an oral reading fluency passage. So we had the child read for a minute at a 4th grade level. He didn't do as well as other kids in his grade. So what do we do next? All right, so do we just put this child in a fluency intervention and just have him read passages? Is that going to help if he has trouble with sound, symbol, knowledge, and decoding? That alone is not going to help. We still need a child to practice reading and text, but we have to match up the intervention with the child's needs. So we can do what we call survey level or diagnostic assessments. The term diagnostic doesn't mean that we're giving a diagnosis or a label of a disability at this point, but we're diagnosing the problem. Kind of like when you go to a mechanic and you've got a noise in your car, we got to look further to see what's going on, right? So we can know how to fix it or to help. Okay, so we might give word level reading or spelling tests to find out not only is it the problem with sounding out words that we need to address, but what kinds of words do we need to teach this child? Is it the long vowels he's having trouble with? Is it the short vowels? Is it both? So we have to dig further. And then our State Department, after this law was passed, just recognizes that students identified at risk in reading through the universal screening process may require additional assessments to figure out if the child has the characteristics of dyslexia. And our law has given us, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different areas that must be measured when we're looking for dyslexia characteristics. So they're all listed here. We're going to go into all of these, but we're going to start with phonological and phonemic awareness. So those are similar words that you'll hear. They are not exactly the same thing, but they are related words. So phonological awareness is the ability to consciously focus attention on subunits of spoken language, so our words in our sentences, syllables, and sounds in words. So these are skills that we can do in the dark. They are all oral activities, so we're listening and we're thinking about sounds. So this is what we need before we ever put letters with sounds. I know we've all heard people speaking foreign languages, right? Does it sound like they're talking really, really fast? It's like, why do people with that language speak so fast? They speak so much faster than we do. And that may not actually be the case. It's just that our brain, not knowing that language, can't separate the words as they're speaking. So we have to unconsciously figure out the spaces between the words. So when I'm talking, I'm not going to slow down and say each word with a pause. Your brain has to do that. So that's one of the first things that we do when we're developing phonological awareness skills. So it is an umbrella term that includes lots of other smaller skills within it. So we could talk about phonological awareness at the word level, syllable level, onset rhyme level, and phoneme level, which let's break those down a little bit. So at the sentence level, for those younger kids, we may be asking them to clap or tap for each word in a sentence. So if I said, it is raining today, we would want them to clap for it is raining today, and know that sentences are made of words, basically. Words are also made of syllables, so the next step is to have a child think about the vowel sounds in the word. And so a word like watermelon would have how many syllables? 4, right? Watermelon. Onset rhyme, we're talking about the part of the word that allows us to rhyme, our HYME. So the onset is basically the consonant or consonants at the beginning. The rhyme is the vowel and everything after it. So the word clap, our onset is kul or kul, and ap would be the rhyme. And then at the phoneme level, this is the last one to develop. This is the smallest unit of sound within our spoken language, that if we change one phoneme, we would change the word. So if we took cat and we changed the k to we would now have a new word, right? So the other term that you'll hear is phonemic awareness. So we said a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound. And let's see, we can manipulate phonemes to make new words, which we talked about there. Okay, so why is it important to measure these skills and to teach these skills? So we need to know how sounds work in our language in order to understand and apply the alphabetic principle, which is when we hear a sound like b, we have to know that it's represented by a letter, B. And we all know that as adults, but kids, when they're learning how to read, they have to be taught that. Some kids have to be, their attention has to be drawn to that more than others do, and those are typically our dyslexic kids. So alphabetic principle is understanding that graphemes, which are letters or groups of letters, so graph just has to do with writing, that they make a sound, okay? So graphemes represent phonemes. So we don't just say letter, because some sounds are represented by groups of letters. So think about CH, making the ch sound. So 2 letters, 1 sound. So we need to be able to do this in order to decode words, sound out words, and to spell. So we have to know how many sounds there are in a word in order to know how many letters we need to represent those sounds. So that's how it relates with spelling. So also predictive, when we look at early, kindergarten, first grade children, we know that their letter name knowledge can predict future reading problems. Vocabulary knowledge, think about how much vocabulary we need to know in order to comprehend what we read. So it's not enough just to sound out words, we have to understand what those words mean. Rapid automatized naming, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So all of these skills are predictive of later reading problems, so we want to measure them. We want to know how a child does on letter naming, letter sounds, that sort of thing. All right, so another part of phonological processing is known as phonological retrieval. So basically, can we retrieve sounds from our memory? And I know I'm oversimplifying that, but we're wanting to know, can this child go to their long-term memory and retrieve that letter name or that sound when they need it? So how many of you have children or students when they were younger, kindergarten, first grade, they're learning their letters, they knew it one day and then they didn't know it the next day? Yes, and you had drilled them and drilled them and drilled them, and then they would go and read a word, they're reading a book, they say the sound of the letter, you go through sounding out the word, then you go to the next page, same word, there's the letter again. What sound does it make? It's like they haven't seen it before. What is up with that? Right? So some of these kids, a lot of these kids, have that information in their brain, but they can't retrieve it when they need it. So if you think about when we're speaking, we all do this, and it gets worse as we get older. You see somebody at church, you see them every week. You've met them, you've talked to them, and all of a sudden you can't think of their name. It's kind of like that, okay? So phonological retrieval. It's kind of that tip of the tongue kind of phenomenon. You might have kids that'll be like, you know, Mama, that stuff, you know, that thing, you know, what's it called, right? So the way that we can measure this, we think, is by using rapid automatized naming, sometimes called rapid automatic naming task or RAN task. So this is an area that is mentioned in our law that must be screened. The way that we screen for it is we show a child a page of letters or numbers. For the younger kids, they get colors and objects, and they basically have to name them as fast as they can. It's a really quick task. We note what their time is. We compare their time to other kids their age. If they're slower, then they have a weakness in rapid naming. And kids who have trouble with this area are the kids who are going to struggle the most with fluency. Because when they see those words and those letter patterns, they can't recall those sounds readily. All right, so our dyslexia law in Tennessee and other laws as well, they also mention alphabet knowledge, decoding, and encoding as other areas that must be measured. So alphabet knowledge, we're basically talking about names of letters. Sound symbol recognition, can they attach those letters with the sounds that they make? So it would be going from a sound like B, knowing that that is represented by B, or if we see a B, knowing that that B makes the B sound. So decoding, again, is sounding out words. So if we see a word, B-A-T-H, we have to be able to give the sound for each of those letters. So B-A-S, and then blend that sound back together. So we're segmenting and blending, which are phonemic awareness skills, but now we're putting letters with it. And encoding would be the reverse of that, would just be spelling. It's just a fancy word for spelling. So if we hear bath, we have to recognize that it's B-ath. And to represent the B with a B, the A with an A, and a th with a TH. And our students with dyslexia really struggle with those skills, which is why we need to measure them to find the dyslexia and also to know what to work on with these kids, what to teach. Okay, so here's an example of a child that we have screened. He's in 7th grade. We've given him the universal screener, just like we did with all 7th grade students. We found out that on this reading comprehension screener, this real quick measure, 1 to 3 minutes, that he did not do well. Okay, so what does that tell us? Does this child need help? Maybe. So we would first want to think about, does this fit with everything else we know about this child? So let's say it does. So he's below benchmark on reading comprehension. So the thought might be, well, let's give him a reading comprehension intervention, right? He struggles with it, let's help him with it. Okay, maybe. So do we know why this child struggles with reading comprehension? If we just have one score that says he's below where he should be in reading comprehension. No, we don't. So we don't know if it's just that he can't understand language and he needs more comprehension strategies and comprehension work, or even does he have a language impairment that needs a speech and language pathologist to work with him? Or could he not read the words in that 7th grade passage? And if you read that word or that passage to him, could he understand it and tell you everything that you just read to him? That's not a comprehension problem. That's a reading problem. It's a word reading problem. So we have to test further to make sure that we give the right intervention. So if we gave the student a reading comprehension intervention and it's the word reading that's the problem, then we're not addressing the real issue here. Okay, so how do we know we have to do more testing? Yes?
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Yes.
The screening items that you mentioned, alphabet awareness, rapid naming, those things, do most kids with dyslexia have all of them, a different host of them? Is it normal for a kid with dyslexia to only have one? I mean, what's the layout?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, for the most part, our children with dyslexia struggle with all those areas. But if you think about rapid naming, that is one that we have kids that score in the average range and they still have dyslexia. So they still have trouble with the word reading and spelling, which are the main things that we want to look for. Phonological awareness, sometimes we could see it when kids are younger, but that's an area that we can teach and bring up with good early intervention. So we might not see that later on phonological awareness test, or it could be that that child really was pretty average already and is still struggling with reading. So they don't have to be low in every single area at any given point in time to have those characteristics. That's a good question because the law doesn't really specify it has to be just in one area or 3 areas or whatever. So we have the flexibility there, which I think is a good thing. Yeah, thank you for that question. Okay, so here's another example. We have a child who's in 3rd grade. We've done the screener like we should. We found out on oral reading fluency, she's really not where she should be for 3rd grade. So again, do we put in a fluency intervention? Do we just have her read and practice reading and practice reading? Well, that's one thing we might need to do, but we might need to do other things. So is it that she's just not fast enough? Of course, fluency, we don't want our kids reading super, super fast, but we want them to read at a normal conversational pace. Is it accuracy? So if we look at that fluency passage, do we see a lot of errors? Is she missing lots and lots of words? In that case, we may need to work on decoding. But how do we know? We have to further assess, okay? So that's what the survey level assessment is in an RTI process, which is also what we would use when we're applying our dyslexia law, because it's supposed to work within the RTI framework, okay? So our law also says that if a child is identified with these characteristics, they have to notify the parent or the guardian. There's usually a letter that comes home that says, we've screened, here's the results. We have to provide a dyslexia-specific intervention, where is that? Yes, number 3, an appropriate tiered dyslexia-specific intervention through the RTI squared process, so that's usually within tier 2 or 3. Some kids may need special education services for that intervention. Dr. Melinda Hirschman is going to talk to us this afternoon about what a good intervention looks like. We have to provide parents with dyslexia resources. So it could be websites, it could be handouts, things like that. And then we have to monitor progress. So in a good RTI system, we're always monitoring progress because we want to see if our intervention is working. And if it's not, we want to make adjustments, right? And parents are supposed to get notification of how the child is doing in those interventions. Okay, the law also established a Dyslexia Advisory Council that meets, I believe it's quarterly, 4 times a year, with the State Department of Education. So I'm on that council. Allison McAvoy, who's going to talk to you next, is also on that council. So the council is made up of different stakeholders, parents, dyslexia advocacy groups, tutors, elementary, middle, and high school teachers. So we have a variety of perspectives. And then professional development resources must be developed by the State Department of Education to help schools with implementing this law, to help them to identify and intervene. And that is a work in progress. Okay, and then there has to be a report. So if you're interested in the report, you can go to the Dyslexia Advisory Council website and find last year's report and then this year's official report. It's in draft mode, but I believe it's December when that will be presented to the legislature. So basically we're saying how many students were screened, how many are getting dyslexia-specific intervention, and let's see, I'll have to look at this one. How many are getting accommodations on the state test? LEA just means local education agency, your district. Description of the interventions they're receiving, and then the growth data on that state test. So is the intervention making a difference? Yeah.
And the Dyslexia Advisory Council is live streamed too.
Yes, yes, and I will have that link at the end. Yes, so she said, if you want to watch the Dyslexia Advisory Council meetings, they're usually from about 10 to about 2. You could jump online and watch any or all of that if you want to. You can also request to speak to the council, but you have to put that request in writing in advance, which I'll have that information for you. Yes?
So does it include the number of students that are screened only through the public school system or through outside sources as well?
Through public school. Okay. Yep. Okay, so we have to provide a dyslexia-specific intervention. We have to monitor progress just like we would in any good RTI system, and parents have to be notified and given information. Okay, so a little bit more about Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. So Tier 2, well, both of them are actually small group interventions. Ideally, we want the children in the group to be at the same skill level or similar skill level. We want to monitor progress every other week at a minimum. And let's see. So there's some guidance around considering Tier 3 after we collect 8 to 10 data points. So that's that progress monitoring data. So basically, we're just giving them a real quick measure to see if we're seeing any growth. But just know that teams can still consider Tier 3 even if we don't have that many data points, if there's a need, okay? Tier 3, we're giving more intensity, so longer time, more frequency or duration, typically 40 to 60 minutes. It varies a little bit by grade level as far as the recommendations go. Tier 2 is usually about 30 minutes a day. And then we want to monitor progress again, okay? All right, so parents through an RTI system need to be notified of the dates that the universal screening is going to happen. Schools are supposed to be notifying parents when they start or stop an intervention or when a child moves from Tier 2 to 3 or vice versa. And if a child is not making progress in Tier 3, special education may be considered. And parents have to be notified before that evaluation can begin. So they're not just going to give your child a special education evaluation and surprise you with it. You have to sign permission. Yes?
What do you mean when you say special education? If they're not showing progress, like in the school, you mean? Like
in the public school system. So if they're in a Tier 3 intervention and we've been providing intervention and the child's not growing like we want him to, he's not closing that gap between him and the peers, then we might say, you know what, this child might need an even more intensive intervention through special education. And we'll talk about what that would look like. Okay, so one thing you have to know, parents may request a special education evaluation at any time. So you do not have to wait for the school to say, hey, we don't think this child's making enough progress. If you think that he's not making enough progress and you want to request an evaluation, you have that right legally to do so, okay? So the U.S. Department of Education has made a statement, I want to say this was around 2011 or so, basically said that RTI cannot be used to delay or deny an evaluation, okay? All right, federal law. So there's a federal law that protects students with disabilities or suspected of having a disability. It's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, last authorized in 2004. So it's been around, let's see, it was the 60s? And so it's been reauthorized or updated every few years, okay? So we use a system or a term called child find. So basically the state says that it is the public school's responsibility, if you suspect that a disability, that a child has a disability, then it's your job to find them and to provide services. Child with disability includes lots of different categories, but it's not every single thing that a child could have. So if you think about all the diagnoses, all the medical conditions that a person could have, we can't have a category for every single one, right? So in order to be able to track and report, we have to have certain categories. Just wanted you to note, functional delay and intellectually gifted are included underneath special education eligibility in Tennessee, but not every state. And I don't have time to get into all of those, but these are different categories that a child could be eligible in for special education. So we have to first document that a child meets state standards for a disability, an educational disability. And that's based on Tennessee Department of Education criteria or whatever state that you live in. And those criteria have to meet federal regulations and guidelines. So there's a little bit of variability from state to state. So you not only have to meet standards for a disability, but the disability also has to impact you to a degree that you cannot function as well, or you can't access grade level material or function in a general education environment without extra supports through special education. So just having a disability alone is not enough. You have to have an adverse effect and show a need. So going back to the dyslexia definition from IDA and the one that's used in Tennessee, it is a specific learning disability. So our screening law does not say that you have to screen every child for a learning disability. It says you have to screen for characteristics of dyslexia. So not every child with characteristics of dyslexia is going to have a specific learning disability. And that's a little confusing. Some of them may have other disabilities, for example.
Erin, can I just say something? So that's something that parents always say. If they go into the school and say, I'd like my child tested for dyslexia, they're going to get no.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for that. All right, so schools are still struggling with what this law means for them and what their responsibilities are under the law. So some schools are doing better than others. So the term dyslexia historically has been an issue. So schools sometimes have been told, we don't test for dyslexia. So when a parent says, hey, I think my child has dyslexia, I've been reading all about it, and it just all the characteristics, they fit him perfectly. Can you test for dyslexia? I think that you're supposed to do that. Will you test it for dyslexia? And a lot of times they get, oh, we don't test for dyslexia. Sorry. And then what, right? So a lot of school personnel don't realize that the specific learning disability definition that is in the federal law actually includes the word dyslexia. So there's a lot of confusion about terminology out there, and I think they mean well. They don't mean to push you off. So one thing that can be helpful is to request a specific learning disability evaluation, and hopefully with our dyslexia law, which we've called the Say Dyslexia Law, that schools will be more comfortable with using that term.
And they can just
We're
ask
working
for
on
a
it.
screening, right? Couldn't they just
They
say,
can still ask for a screening for dyslexia.
characteristics.
So yeah, so if you get pushback on that, which hopefully you won't, but you might, you could say, well, I know that the Tennessee law says you have to screen for dyslexia, and if you're looking for a special education evaluation, you may want to use the term specific learning disability. Yes?
Erin, okay, like Jackson starting out, well, we've been dealing with this for over 2 years now, and they did, they screened him to school and all that kind of stuff and everything, and they knew he had a problem, but we never heard the word dyslexia until we finally got him over to Vanderbilt. Knew you have to wait a long, long time to get in there, but we didn't even hear dyslexia until we went to Vanderbilt. So again, it's hard because they don't know how. I mean, they don't know what exactly it falls into or which disability it might be.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll go there next. So dyslexia is included in the specific learning disability definition. Let me hit the right button. I just want you to know 13 to 14% of students receive special education services. Of those, half are underneath a specific learning disability category. And of those with specific learning disability or SLD, about 85% have reading or language processing problems. So the majority of kids receiving special education services are receiving it because of reading problems, okay? Specific learning disability criteria in Tennessee. You have to have underachievement in basic reading, fluency, reading comprehension, written expression, or areas of math. You have to show an insufficient response to instruction. That's what that progress monitoring data tells us. And we have to make sure that it's not primarily due to vision or hearing or motor problems, intellectual disability, which is a different type of disability, emotional disturbance, cultural factors, economic disadvantage, limited English, or excessive absenteeism, okay? So all of that has to be looked at. Those exclusionary factors are pretty much the same across the country. Okay, so specific learning disability. In reading, you'll see 3 different areas. Written expression is its own area. And then math, we have calculation skills. So can they add, subtract, multiply, divide at their grade level? And can they problem solve in math? So if you give them a problem, can they figure out, am I supposed to add? Am I supposed to subtract? And so on. Some of our students will have oral language problems. So they may have trouble with articulating sounds, which is a speech impairment. And if that's not appropriate for their age, they may need services in that area. Some students have trouble receiving oral information, so receptive language would be low. They may have trouble with understanding what's being said to them or listening comprehension. They may have trouble expressing themselves orally, or they may have a stutter. So if these are concerns, the speech language pathologist would need to be consulted. So a lot of our students with reading problems have these additional issues. Okay, so specific learning disability in reading, we're talking about basic reading skills. Students have trouble matching letters to sounds in order to read words. Reading fluency, those are the kids who have difficulty reading quickly, accurately, and with proper expression. Do these things sound familiar? That's what we've been talking about this morning. And then we have reading comprehension. So these are the kids who can read okay as far as the words, but they don't really understand what they're reading. So if you think about our definition of dyslexia, basic reading skills, reading fluency, those are the areas that's dyslexia, okay? Reading comprehension deficits, some of our kids will have problems here. Some of them won't so much. But it's not the primary issue. So if you think about dyslexia, reading comprehension is secondary to those word reading problems. So our students who are eligible, who have dyslexia, who are eligible for special education services, more than likely it would be in specific learning disability in the area of basic reading or reading fluency. All right, and we have federal guidance for 2015 that says basically schools have permission to use the term dyslexia, dyscalculia, which has to do with math, it's just another word for learning disability math, or dysgraphia, which is writing problems. It's okay to use those words. So it's giving the schools permission, you could say it, okay? But we still have to use the SLD term too. And the reason is that the state and federal guidelines require us to do that. So if your school has the term specific learning disability on that child's IEP, that is what they're supposed to have, okay? And that's okay. All right, so the Say Dyslexia bill in Tennessee, the state is just clarifying that it is not a separate disability category. So this is a sample IEP that's on the state website. IEP stands for Individual Education Program, so it's for children who are eligible for special education services. On the front, the disability category will be listed. For dyslexia, you're going to see specific learning disability. Again, that's okay. So where do we put it? We want dyslexia to be recognized. So it's not a medical problem. We won't put it there, even though that's kind of the instinct. But there's a place at the top of the second page, and this is what it looks like in Tennessee. Not every state's IEP looks exactly like this, but it's similar. There's a place to write in student strengths and weaknesses and parent concerns, and also to talk about how this student's disability is affecting their progress in general education. So remember, we have to show an adverse effect in order to be eligible. So that's where we could put it. The other stuff is just test scores and things like that. Okay, so you could say something like, we want our child to improve in reading. He struggles with spelling and writing. This is dyslexia, thank you. So we want him to receive a dyslexia intervention. So you could say whatever you want there in the team. You're part of the team as a parent, and they can put that in. You could do something simple like his learning disability in basic reading or dyslexia is impacting his ability to read grade level text. So that's public schools. So do we have any private school parents in here? One? Any homeschoolers? So you have rights too. So the school system, public school system, again through Child Find, they're responsible for finding and offering and providing services to kids with disabilities. Parents have a right to choose whether they homeschool or do private school, so they can refuse services if they want to. But basically, you can request an evaluation from the public school system. It does vary from state to state about which district is responsible for the evaluation. In Tennessee, if you're homeschooling, you would contact the school where your child's zoned. Private school, this has changed in, 10 years ago it wasn't this, but now you contact the district where the school is located. And you say, I want my child evaluated for special education, and you describe the concerns, okay? If they're eligible, they'll be offered services, and then you could say yes or no to those services. And in private school, instead of an IEP, they would get a service plan. All right, so some people have their evaluations done outside of the school, which is fine. But you have to know kind of what that means in the public school. When you take that evaluation to the team, what are they going to do with it? What do they have to do? So first of all, a private evaluator, and if you're talking about a private psychologist, clinical psychologist, they're going to use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, DSM-5 for short, and they call it specific learning disorder. So instead of disability, it's now disorder, but still SLD, so that helps. So when they updated it last, they made it more closely aligned to what the schools are doing, which I think is helpful. So basically, again, they're noting whether it is an impairment in accuracy, fluency, or comprehension, but the term dyslexia, they don't have to use it. They can use it. So there's a note in there, it says it's an alternate term, but they may not. So just know that too. But again, if it's a specific learning disorder, it affects word reading accuracy or fluency, it's dyslexia, okay? So if you bring this to the school, they have to consider, that's the language that's used in law, they have to consider this evaluation, but they still have to look to see what the state criteria is for eligibility, and the student still has to meet all those criteria, okay? All right, so we said dyslexia is a specific learning disability. So does that mean if you have characteristics of dyslexia, you have a specific learning disability? It's kind of, you really have to wrap your brain around this, it's kind of hard. But the answer is no. So dyslexia and reading achievement in general occurs on a continuum. So we have the kids who are just super good readers. It's almost like they didn't even have to learn. That's just a few kids. Most of our kids are somewhere in the middle. They all need good, explicit reading instruction, like what Melinda's going to tell us about this afternoon. We have a lot of kids who don't respond well, and those are going to be the ones who are poor readers, but it is on a continuum. There's also a continuum of services, so it's all based on the child's need. So just because you have a certain label doesn't mean you automatically get a certain service, because you may or may not need that service, okay? So some of our kids with milder characteristics of dyslexia, they can have some supports and accommodations in general ed and Tier 1. Most of them would probably need a Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention where they're going out for extra help in reading every day or every other day. And within general education, so that's Tier 1, 2, and 3, a student may be eligible for a 504 plan. And Allison's going to talk to us about what that means after lunch. So that is a plan that provides accommodation for kids outside of special education services. If you have an IEP, you don't need a 504 plan because you're getting accommodations within that IEP, okay? So it all depends on the child's need, basically. Okay, so what do you do if you need help? So one thing you could do is ask, what is my child getting? So a lot of times our parents are told, you know, we're going to do Tier 2 with their child. Well, ask questions. What exactly are you doing with my child? What skills are you working on? What kind of program are you using? And that's okay. And they could sit down and explain that to you. So don't be afraid to talk to your school. Ask for more information on benchmark and progress monitoring scores. So schools have to share that information with you. Sometimes you get it home and you look at it, actually lots of times. What does this mean? Like, what is this number and that number, and is this a good score, is it a bad score? You know what, most of us can't figure what that is, and it is okay. Don't be embarrassed to ask questions about that. Ask for a meeting, have them sit down and go through that with you. So we ask for that kind of data at our center when we do evaluations, and if we haven't been trained on that particular test or screener, sometimes we have to dig and get more information, even though, you know, we do this all the time. So don't be embarrassed to ask for explanation of that. And you can request a student support team meeting at any time as a parent. So you can have a meeting with the teacher and the reading specialist and the principal if you want to. You have that right. And that just kind of gets everybody on the same page, and they will be happy to meet with you. You can request a dyslexia screening if it hasn't been done or if you don't know if it's been done. And then if you feel that your child needs it, you also have the right to request a special education evaluation You want to find out who to send that to. So sometimes parents will ask the wrong person at the school and they're told bad information. Unfortunately, they don't mean to, but you know, it happens. I would ask the principal if you're not sure who to send it to. Put it in writing because it has more teeth, right? So they have to respond if it's in writing. And then once that happens, they will meet with you, talk about whether or not they agree that evaluation is needed. So they do have a right to refuse. Most of the time they will agree if there's a reason to think that we might have a disability. And then the school has 60 days to complete the evaluation. Sounds like forever, right? But this includes snow days, this includes weekends, fall break, all of that. So it's 60 calendar days to complete the evaluation. And just remember, be patient with that process because there are a lot of kids and usually one person to do those evaluations, speaking from experience. So I had 3 schools. That meant I was at one school 1 day a week, 4 days in a month, right? So unfortunately, assessment specialists are spread really thin. So if it's taken a long time, just know they have 60 days and they will get to your child as soon as they can. They're trying, okay? So after that 60 days is up, you'll have a meeting and talk about eligibility. And then before special education services can happen, the parent would have to sign permission for that to happen. And so the parent is a big part of that team that makes those decisions on what a child needs at that point. All right. So again, you will get this handout emailed to you, so the Dyslexia Advisory Council page is there for you. There are a lot of resources on that page, so you want to check that out too. We also have a resource list that we have emailed to you, which has a list of advocacy groups. One of them is STEP, and they provide free services to parents. They do webinars, they do workshops across the state. Where they help parents understand what their rights are. They do IEP workshops, they do 504 workshops. They're a really great resource. Other states, if you're not in Tennessee, there is a similar organization. They're not all called STEP, that's just what Tennessee's called, but the Parent Center Hub will get you to that place. Okay, I think we have maybe 5 minutes, great. Any other questions? Any burning questions?
If you've got a child that's in Tier 3, are they supposed to be providing you on a weekly basis what your child's progress is?
So the question is, if your child's receiving Tier 3 interventions, are you supposed to be getting progress updates? So I want to say it's every 4.5 weeks is when they have to provide that.
So basically once a month.
Yeah, about once a month. Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have a question about the actual understanding of the tier. So you've got your general population in the school. Do all of the general population start in a Tier 1? Or is that just for students who have been recognized as being needing support?
Okay, yeah, great question. So our question is about Tier 1. So Tier 1 just means everybody. Everybody's in Tier 1, so they don't have to be placed there or screened to be in Tier 1. That's just another word for their regular education classroom setting.
So if you've had a student who's been in intervention since, say, kindergarten, but then you get a letter that says they're being moved to Tier 2, what does that mean?
What intervention were they in kindergarten?
It just said reading intervention.
Okay. So I would ask.
You would ask.
I would ask. Sometimes a teacher will provide an intervention. A lot of elementary school teachers will do reading groups, so they'll bring a group to the back of their class and work with them while other kids are doing other things. Sometimes they consider that an intervention.
I think he was actually leaving the classroom. So
Leaving the
that's why I was
classroom.
confused.
Yeah, so I would ask.
Okay.
There's different labels for interventions, and that can get confusing. So yeah, just ask for clarification. Mm-hmm. Any other questions, comments? Everybody's hungry? I'm hungry. Okay, well, if there's no questions, I appreciate your time and attention, and I think someone will tell us about lunch.